Is Glenn here?
He's not on yet.
He's not on. Okay. So the CFO is planning to join online. I know. I don't think anybody else is. I haven't heard from anyone who's planning on coming. But we'll go ahead and get started. Sorry I missed the last conversation in person. It was a good, robust conversation from what I was able to hear. I put together, just to get my own head in the right place, a list of what I thought are the issues that are sort of outstanding, that seem to raise either questions or where people were not in agreement, or otherwise seem to merit additional conversation. That's in front of you. And I'm happy to add to this list. I'm happy to take them in whatever order others would like. I've got job creation related business tax incentives, the handout from last week that I think was handed out in hard copy we not discussed. I know there are a lot of questions and thoughts about the business activity tax idea that still warrant discussion. Child tax credit, a couple of questions came up last time. Automatic traffic enforcement fines, and an alternative suggestion based on some of the feedback from last time. And questions were raised about some of the additional base broadening proposals. I want to see if we want to address those. Question about phasing in tax changes for beauty bonds and retirement benefits for surviving spouses. Share some thoughts there. And I'm listing these largely in the order in which they are in the mark, not necessarily in order of importance, but I know that there's a lot of conversation we want to talk about property, property taxes. I should have put number one on this list, the property taxes for on high value homes. Sales taxes, a couple of questions have come up around both street vendors and around the sales tax rate on restaurants. And then this question about revenue neutrality, we can get to that. Is there anything that doesn't fall on this list that folks want to make sure we get to? I don't know if we're going to get to everything on this list today. Is there anything else that should be here that isn't? All right, CFO is online, and they jump in. All right, so let's start with, Mr. Chairman, do you want to say anything before we start? All right, nothing to say, that's fine. Last week you all saw a proposal that was handed out around tax incentives for job creation. I think a number of folks expressed interest in how can we be more explicit about this package being oriented towards creation of jobs here in DC. This write-up reflects an interest that I know Jody has. I'm sorry she's not here, but she connected with the firm Cushman & Wakefield, which has a whole practice around this area, around tax incentives. And based on the conversations I had with their experts on tax incentives, I wrote up this idea and confirmed with them that this is what they had in mind. And I think this is something that Jody had in mind. I hate to speak for her, but essentially what this proposal would do, DC does not now have a sort of a multi-sector tax credit aimed specifically around creating jobs. A lot of other jurisdictions do have things like this. So this proposal would allow DMPED to award a specified amount of job creation tax credits every year. If they are creating, or potentially if they are retaining, 25 full-time equivalent new jobs. It could have to be a slightly lower number if it's a business and an economic opportunity zone. So we're looking at sort of substantial job creation efforts. The credit would be, and the credit would be a credit against their business taxes, but it would be based on the amount of withholding and payroll taxes that the company is expecting to pay for each newly created job for DC resident employees. And there would be job standards in terms of the amount of pay and health benefits. And a key dimension here is that companies would be required to indicate that they are also getting similar offers from other jurisdictions. And DMPID, this would really be a discretionary program for DMPID to run. And this would allow DMPID to connect it to their economic development strategy. So if they're targeting particular sectors, DMPID might choose to award this to those to jobs that are being created in those sectors. DMPID would really be required to assess the question is, are we really creating new jobs, or these jobs are similar jobs that are going to come to the district anyway? The research suggests that credits like this can be effective in creating new jobs. They're not always effective. In other words, to some extent, some of the jobs that are created would emerge anyway. But if you invest in a program like this, it does have the potential to create at least some new jobs that otherwise wouldn't exist. I think another argument against doing something like this is just that it could be, economic development authorities sometimes prefer to do their incentives in the form of direct spending programs rather than tax credits. So here we're focusing on the tax side. My sense from DMPID is they're looking at a wide range of options for attracting jobs in the district on both the spending side and the tax side. So I'm going to leave it at that. The suggestion from Cushman & Wakefield was a $25 million investment program, annual program, but obviously this could be scaled up again. Discuss?
I think we have to do something. So I support this. I mean, every day it seems like more jobs are leaving the city. We just heard what yesterday Fannie Mae is exiting 5 years early. This package doesn't really have anything thus far to incentivize people to come here. And I personally think we've got to do something because the evidence is strong that jobs are leaving.
Quick, what's the thought of the competing? Where was that?
Offers from other jurisdictions?
Right, the offers from other jurisdictions. Because if I'm a company, let's say I'm in Alexandria, and I have a ability to locate to DC because this incentive incents me to do so, and there is no incentive from Alexandria, but the incentive to come here provides this credit, isn't that a good thing? Why does there have to be a competing incentive to compare this against? That just jumps out at me. What's the thought about that?
I didn't do this, but I think this gets at the what-for question. So big creditors and the incentives is that they were going to do it anyway. This price would answer that question, right?
Yeah, that's my understanding. The Cushman & Wakefield folks actually suggested this as a way to make sure that you are not just giving credits to companies who are going to move here. You could make that optional. You could say, look, if you got an offer somewhere else, submit it as part of your application, and DMPID could evaluate it.
But what if it's just cheaper? What if versus Virginia, where it costs $5,000 less per employee to hire someone? So they start with a May I finish?
Of course.
Yes, it does. When you start factoring costs like commercial space, insurance, unemployment insurance, workers' comp, parking taxes, it costs more. All right, that's my point of view. Yesham, you may have yours, but it costs more to work in the district than Northern Virginia. All right, so by offering $5,000 as a tax incentive, even though Virginia doesn't offer anything else, what that does is levels the playing field. I agree with what I think you're saying, Rashad, is that maybe that's not necessary, or at least we can be flexible on it.
I'm suggesting giving flexibility to, and I don't know how you do this in a way that doesn't do what you're talking about, Mayor, but I could see a circumstance where a business comes here because this is an attractive proposition, not as compared to some other incentive offered, but we've made it cheaper for them, or that is the factor for which they're making their decision, independent of another incentive.
I think one way to think of it is, that I think that a lot of the, my own view is a lot of the incentives in DC over the years, people had expectations of, good financial returns, and you had incentives on top of that that work very well, like the waterfront. But if you do the incentives alone, not so good. It really has to be nested in a whole pitch toward expectations of, I think.
Jim, I know you wanted to jump in. And hi, Jody. Just to bring you up to speed.
Apologies.
No worries at all. But just so you know, we are talking about the job creation
All right,
tax
I'm all
incentive. After Jim goes, you might want to say a word or two on that.
CFO weighed in on the implementation today.
Yeah, the way the CFO would score this is essentially it would be counted as a cost in every year when the credit was actually claimed, not when it is awarded. So for instance, let's say DenFed awards 20, as I understand it, let's say DenFed awards, $1 million in tax credits over 5 years to company X. That would be considered that would be scored for budgeting purposes as a $200,000 revenue loss in each of those 5 years. So sort of over the long term, if you have $25 million a year that you're allowing DenFed to award, it would score out to average out to about $25 million a year in costs that would have to be taken into account. Does that make sense? Jody, I said a little bit about how the process of how this proposal was developed in terms of our conversations with Fishman and Wakefield. Do you want to say anything more about it?
Not right now.
Okay.
Sorry.
No worries. It was a handout last week.
Yeah.
Someone made it up.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this? Pro, con, tinkers, otherwise?
Well, I guess it's just, I'd like to have the CFO just reaffirm that it has to be scored that way, and there's no way to have it done whereby, since this is all but for economic activity, it could be neutral. I know it can't be, but it's just put it out there.
Glenn, are you able to hear we were having audio challenges last week, a little better this, you came on video, so I assume that means you know your name has been mentioned.
I do. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you great.
My understanding is we would score it just as Nick's described. Inherently, we estimate growth in revenue, that is growth of the economy, more jobs and so forth, although those numbers are lower than they were in the teens, clearly. So we would see this as an expense because some of that growth would now get a benefit here, a reduction in their tax.
Okay. Are the employees not paying tax?
Say again?
Are the employees themselves not paying tax?
Are the employees themselves not paying tax?
So if the employer gets the benefit, and there is a net reduction in revenue because the employer is getting the benefit, but aren't the employees themselves paying tax on their income?
Yeah, of course.
Right, and so is this 25 million a net number? Or is that the amount it will cost us without identifying?
Without taking into account the
Oh,
taxes.
the taxes are
Yeah,
collected by the employee that they pay. Oh.
But no, what I'm trying to understand is if we say we're giving 25 million, I'm speaking loudly because no one can hear here. If we're giving the employer a $25 million tax break, and they've hired X number of people, presumably the people they've hired, some of them will live in the district. You can tether that perhaps to district residents. The taxes that the employees will be paying will be coming into the treasury just as the reduction is leaving. I just want to make sure that 25 million includes what the employees will be paying in tax as an offset of what the employer is not paying, that's all.
One of the things we discussed, one of the things that we did discuss with Cushman when we were talking about this, and that it's done in other municipalities, is that you can put a requirement for the jobs that are created to get this tax benefit that 25% have to be DC residents or X percent have to be DC residents, to your point, to make sure that you are creating income tax in the city and you're employing residents. How this was scored, I'm not sure if we looked at the increase of income tax or if this is just purely on corporate tax.
As far as I know, it's purely on corporate tax.
So there's probably
I would reserve clarifying that with my staff.
One last thing, Jody.
Right, I understand that.
I appreciate that you've taken the laboring oar on this. In Virginia, as far as the difficulty of administering from a tax perspective, Virginia does this. You know what I mean? We don't have to go far. We go to Richmond to talk with folks about how do you execute. And we may want to model our program, if I'm honest, after Richmond or after Virginia's, if they're the principal point of competition.
I am wide open. I talked to several people. I wanted to get a national perspective of whoever was doing it best. So we wound up, I probably talked to 8 different groups. At the end of the day, it seemed that Cushman, who Tony and Nick also had a conversation with, sort of had this big breadth of, they were seeing it nationally and they had a lot of experience. We talked to somebody, she's out of New York and Florida, but runs their practice nationally. But I think if the best thing to model is sitting across the river in Virginia, I'm all for that. I just think it's really important that we look at expanding our base here in the district, that we're really thinking long-term about how we drive revenues here, not just broadening who's here today, but really expanding it. And so I think it's important that we think about how we create jobs that will also create more residents and jobs that are higher, are living wage sort of jobs beyond just hospitality and retail jobs that are going to be good paying generational jobs in the city. So I feel open, David, if the best place is across the river, then let's model that. There's a
new company incentive program. A quick search on your phone will reveal that discusses exactly how it's done in Virginia, how much has to be invested, how many jobs have to be created, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a phone number of the person who administers it. I just don't think this is super hard to figure out. And if they're our principal competitor, then maybe we should understand it, and maybe we should model it or improve upon it. They're called New Company Incentive Program. Now it's proposed less. But in any event, there's an eligibility, a process, resources, the whole thing is right here on the Virginia Economic Development Partnership website.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts on this? Perhaps folks who know this one.
Are we going to discuss now or later about whether or not this needs to be offset in our package by something else?
Up to you. I mean, I think that, at some point probably be a good conversation to have. We can talk about it as we go through.
I leave that to your discretion when it's the right time.
My discussion. Should we save it to the end, perhaps?
Why not?
There was a bunch of questions last time about the business activity tax, and I know a number of folks around the table have been thinking about it. Jim, did you want to jump in? Okay. I thought I would share. I did a little more thinking about some of the questions that have come up. In terms, so a couple things. terms of the impact on different types of businesses, I think one question was about, well, what about a business, say a grocery store or another retailer with a relatively small profit margin? In other words, where profits are pretty small as a share of overall receipts, where they're spending, where the retailer is spending most of its money, most of the receipts are actually going to purchase inventory from suppliers. So in the packet that's in front of you, the second page, I sort of adapted the examples from last time to apply to a small retailer, a sole proprietorship who's now paying the UB tax. In this example, gross receipts are about $1.5 million, $100,000 on rent, another 1.115, about 75% of receipts going to purchases, inventory, supplies. The taxable net income, in other words, the profit for tax purposes is $75,000, and then this business would have $100,000 in personal property. If you look at under current law, the business tax that they're paying is the UB tax, franchise tax, 8.25% of their net income minus the UB exemption allowance. They're paying slightly under $4,000 a year in UB tax. Under option one, where we keep the UB tax, this business would be paying just $250 in VAT. They would also be paying business franchise tax, but the VAT would be a credit against the business franchise tax, so there would be no change in the business's tax. Under option two, in the chairman's mark, the rate's a little higher, so the VAT's a little higher, $700, but the business franchise tax wouldn't be there, and so their total tax would go from $3,900 down to about $700. And what this just illustrates is that businesses where purchases from other firms are a big chunk of what they do, have relatively low, the VAT doesn't really affect them very much, and in fact can represent a fairly small, large tax amount. It also illustrates the impact of that $200,000 exemption on smaller type businesses. In terms of a startup, the other kind of business that I looked at a little bit thought was a startup business. And we touched on this briefly. When you're, I think someone asked, well, what happens, how does VAT treat that venture capital investment, that initial investment of capital in the business? And the answer is, that's not taxed. That's not considered part of gross receipts under the definition of income under current tax forms. So that would carry over to the VAT. So as long as the startup is relying on its initial capital to cover costs, it would not pay VAT. But as soon as it starts making sales to clients in DC, its VAT liability above $200,000, its VAT liability would rise proportionately, and that could happen before it is actually turning a profit.
If I could though, it's the startup is going to hire 10 people or 20 people or 50 people or 100 people. It is going to apply, it's going to apply to their labor costs, whether or not they even sell a thing. They don't have to sell a single product until the 1.4% starts applying on their personnel costs. I see this example where there is a concentration on the purchase of items with relatively low, your example, relatively low labor cost. But if you flip the script for those employers that have a lot of labor costs, that 1.4% applies across the board. So, you think of any kind of service industry where they have a lot of people. That's a different proposition than a grocery store that might have just a few people and purchasing a lot of items. You flip the script, the 1.4% starts. It also doesn't answer the question of what happens to the companies who aren't making any money. And the message that this sends about the threshold you have to go through in the district to invest and make decisions. So if we're trying to get, and I'll stop here, but if we're trying to incentivize people to come to underserved areas and they know that it's a struggle to begin with, and it's a 1.4% off the top, that's a disincentive in my opinion. And as far as startups, as I say, I've been in this field now for 8-10 years. I have been in meetings with venture capitalists. This isn't speculation. I didn't read this in a book. I didn't pretend to understand this. I'm telling you what will happen. They're not going to send money to the district under these circumstances. Jody, you're in this world. What are we missing?
I think there's no, but my concern is, number one, how to sit startups for sure. Number two, I think right now in this business climate, we just had Fannie Mae announce yesterday that they're leaving the city, a huge number of jobs. I worry that the lawyers move across, and we can all have our own feelings about the lawyers and whether it's fair or not fair, but I think overlaying a business activity tax of any type right now just says pack up and go home if you're, that's my biggest concern right now. But certainly our future is going to be in startups, I think. I don't think we can rely on the federal government. But I'm consistent. I haven't moved from where I was last time, so.
Maybe just to clarify something, there's two ways of doing a value-added tax. One is an addition method tax, and this is what New Hampshire does. Their value-added tax is the sum of labor expenses, dividends, expenses, profits. The proposal here is a little bit different. It would be what we call a subtraction method of that. So it's gross receipts minus purchases minus rent minus a $200,000 exemption. What this means is that in that first year, when the company brings on a bunch of employees and is paying them salary, until it is starting to get revenue from its gross receipts, it is not yet paying the business activity tax. But I agree, it would be paying business activity tax when it is making sales, but it is not earning profits. So that's just a clarification.
So this will also apply to investments, right? So if you're purchasing equipment, that doesn't get subtracted out.
It does.
It does.
Yeah.
But just other capital expenditures, other than. Well, look, I think I'm unpersuaded that this is the kind of message we want to be sending now. To Jody's point, if this is directed at large law firms that fill these buildings that are currently in harm's way financially with vacancy rates and unstable loans, if we want to really spook our largest tenants at a point when downtown is struggling, this is the way to do it. It just is. So, and I've yet to see the case for, look, if we have to obliterate all the tax incentives we supposedly put in this for businesses, I would take them all off the table. All 275 million of the tax reductions that we have proposed, I would take them all off the table and wipe this out, and we would be even.
Well, I support the chairman's mark with this as it is. I think you can obviously find one or two scenarios that are going to be problematic for somebody. You've outlined things here that I think are representative of all that we really want to think about. Will come out either better off or close to it. The 1.4% sounds like a lot, but it's in lieu of an 8.25% if they're paying the corporate franchise tax or even less with the other tax. It eliminates two taxes altogether. That's going to be broadly benefit people. Virginia, they already have a tax like this, and I know it's poo-poo to call this about the fairness thing. The city is in the predicament it's in because of unfairness over the decades of who doesn't pay. And so we can just perpetuate that forever and let the powerful people, and they are powerful and they are wealthy, continue to get a good deal. And if we're not going to stand up and say what's right is right, then we can go on and just continue with it like it is. Look at where it's got us. Not in a great place economically. And I just think that it's not as though this is being taken and spent on something else. This reduction is being put back into the business community in strategic ways. So it's really a net. And the people who are gonna pay more are wealthy, powerful people who generally live in the suburbs. They're gonna be mad, and perhaps they'll leave, we'll see. But the benefit is gonna go to people in DC doing economic activity. So breaking eggs is difficult anytime you do it, but that's kind of the threshold where we are.
So are we asking questions about the bet, or are we voting on the bet?
What would you like to do? What would you like to see?
I think what I'd like to see, because I have my own views, I'd like to see us go through one final question, and then we can all state our case and give the conclusions.
Can we hear your views?
Hmm?
I'd be interested to hear your views.
Well, they're related, they're kind of all related, so I would just like to get the questions in. And my question is, if I'm a Virginia resident, and I'm in a firm, and I pay this tax, can I, if there were an income tax, I could credit against Virginia or Maryland, could I credit that thing against Virginia or Maryland or not?
Probably not. So right now, Virginia actually does not even allow its residents to claim a deduction for the UV tax. Virginia has decided that even though the standard practice among states with income taxes allow credit for income taxes paid by the other states, it has decided that the UV tax does not count for its purposes as an income tax. There's been court litigation about that.
And my other
Maryland
question,
does allow. So I don't think so.
And my other question is, the best case you could make for the bat in my mind is that there are people in the firms who right now aren't paying anything in the DC, and under this regime would be paying taxes in DC for the first time, right? They're not.
Essentially, yeah, the business that they own. I mean, technically, we have to say it's an entity level tax, because that's what we're allowed to do. But
But if you
effectively, the
take,
economic
the
impact.
DC partners can offset their other taxes against this, really it's falling on the DC and Maryland or other partners, right?
Maryland
That's
related
the best
partners.
case that we may do this, right?
It depends on the accounting, though, Mayor. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it depends on the accounting. It depends on if you have a firm, you're Inc. and Gump, and you have $1 billion in revenue, and we come and ask for $14 million, say, right? And you think, well, the firm is going to pay the $14 million. How they divvy it up with their partners is anyone's guess. How they attribute it is anyone's guess. And how Lynn administers it is in anyone's guess. Because if that Virginia partner decides to work from home, or you pick a firm with a Virginia office, they decide to work from home, they simply retether where they're from. And that money disappears.
So the way tax, under this proposal, as under current law for our business taxes, the way a partner's, any business would determine its DC tax liability would be multiplying its total business activity nationwide, so gross receipts minus purchase, rents, royalties, capital investments, by its DC sales factor. So by its share of DC sales as a share of total sales nationwide. Because DC is a single sales factor state, and because we use what's called market-based sourcing, the percentage is based on where the client is, not where the person is sitting to do the work. So for sales of professional services, and this is showing the current law and we'll be showing the VAT, a DC sale is one where the service is delivered to the DC address.
So Trump lawyers would be paying taxes.
Say again?
Trump lawyers that are here in DC defending him against various circuit courts that are not currently paying taxes will be paying taxes actually under this proposal.
Right.
Is that correct?
And lawyers are accustomed to doing it. They already do this, you
So
know.
why don't we get through this and then people can state how
Okay.
they're gonna come out on this, and I'll start off on that.
Okay. I think a question arose about legal implications. We did get a memo in from from a lawyer, a law professor at Northeastern Law School, who's an expert in state and local tax policy, Professor Peter Enrich. Submitted a memo, and I'm happy to share it around, but his argument, his view is the business activity tax will be a tax on the economic activity of the business, rather than a tax on the profits of its owners. And so his read of the Home Rule Act, the Bishop Court's interpretation of the Home Rule Act, is it would be very surprising if a court were to extend that prohibition to the VAT. I don't think anyone disagrees that there will be litigation around that, but his view, and I've heard other experts say the same, that it would, that this would be a very strong ground in this case.
Do we have any opinion from the CFO's GC or the Attorney General's office about this?
I've had informal conversations with them, but they haven't done a formal analysis.
What's their what's their risk related to the informal conversation? How do they view this?
I'm not sure I want to characterize it as it's sort of off-the-cuff conversations, and I'm sure they would prefer not to be quoted until they can really do their research. But I think the first part that this would be contended is no one disagrees.
So today, going to the relative weight of these things, 1, 2, 3. The repeal of the personal profit tax, what is the average cost? What is the average business worth?
The HVAC is
What's the average cost of the personal property tax?
the average cost of average personal property tax. I mean, it's about a $75 million revenue source for DC. It's paid by, I think, about 1,500, 2,000 firms. So there's about 60,000 businesses that file, that submit returns, personal property tax returns. Only about 1,500 of them actually have tax liability.
Paperwork is onerous, right?
Yeah, it's a 6-page form that's kind of a pain in the neck. So I think it would depend on if you average it across all, if you average that $75 million across all 60,000 people who are subject to it, or across the 1,500 who actually pay it. I'm not fast enough to do the math. Richard is sitting here doing the math.
I have a question. I think the issue with that, Jim, is that even the companies that are exempt have to file the form. It's like a 15-page form. So for lots of small businesses, we get dinged at the DC Postal Center. Every year we lose clean hands. It takes 2 weeks to figure out why the hell we lost it. So it's actually one of the benefits of removing it. And maybe it could be done in a different way if we keep the tax in place, is really reducing these unduly burdens on smaller establishments. That's another argument.
My point is, the gross amount is 77 million.
That's right.
If it's an incentive, a business to move or leave here, how much is a typical business pay? It doesn't make sense to make a decision and say, get it out. Take this 77 million, divide it on the bar.
I think when it might work is if you're a big law firm with a lot of property that's taxable, so you're getting hit by the, what was it, the business activity tax, but you get a little bit something in return. You don't pay the personal property taxes, you get a little bit of reduction in your rent because of the triple lease. We just don't know exactly how this will fall, but that was the idea, at least.
The very simple math is just do what's paid divided by how many people pay it. It's like roughly $50,000 per firm, but it would probably look like some firms are paying a lot, some firms are paying little. As Jessica says, all firms have to deal with the administrative burden of the tax.
My comment is, have we gotten any public opinion from any of these large law firms in terms of the VAT, formally or informally?
Do you want to talk about our meeting with them?
Yeah, because I thought we had a meeting. Yeah.
We had and I've been around the block. We had a meeting with the large law firms. The one partner in a firm who lives in DC got the, if you live in DC, we intend to hold you harmless. We got that. The other firms were saying, well, we understand what you're trying to do, and we do understand this, and we do understand that, which I read to be, we understand this, we appreciate this, we're going to go out and kill it. And then we'll go out and kill it, yeah.
Yeah, kill the VAT.
Kill
Yes.
the VAT.
Can I ask a,
The other feedback we got, is partners who are paying UB and DC residents. That's another interesting group to think about, because if we pass the chairman's mark as it is, then their income liability could be increasing because they're paying at 11%, whatever, as opposed to, so that's another feedback.
Just so we don't So this can order our versus we keep arguing over the points rather than asking questions. So I do not support that any longer because the first big bill in my mind was monumental. The second big bill was Fannie Mae. To me, if you have 30% of the law firms left in DC, the patient is in the ICU, in the operating room. This is not the time to experiment with a brand new tax system. I do not believe that. There's too much uncertainty in just how the damn thing works. We don't even know that. So we really can't really properly message it. And we have dramatic, I think, existential uncertainty as to what the behavior of the law firm is going to be. And I think we have to risk on the side of caution and not play with this. We're business serious. That's how I personally feel now.
Mayor, can I ask a question about the personal property tax issue? I'm all for removing the administrative burden for people who don't pay. That seems like a no-brainer. It's also a savings so that Glenn's people can do things that are really important rather than process silly paperwork. I want to ask, though, if we're going to allow a personal property tax exemption, is that not at odds with what we're trying to do to incentivize employees? And the reason is, if, for instance, automation becomes if we no longer tax personal property, if we no longer tax the things that permit and accelerate automation, would that not encourage automation? And so, think about, things like in a fast food restaurant where you can go and order using equipment, or parking gates, or any number of areas where, front desk people, any number of areas where you can automate and no longer have a tax penalty for that. So we're incentivizing automation. Does that not disincentivize workers? That's the question, and I don't know.
Yeah, it depends on if you think about equipment as a substitute for workers or as a complement to workers. Workers, a lot of workers need the equipment to do their job, so we sort of cut those both ways. There was one study done for the 1998 Tax Commission that found a statistical correlation between lower personal property taxes and more jobs. But I think it was not a particularly strong correlation. I'll just say a word about whether nonprofits should be subject to the VAT. Nonprofits represent roughly a fifth of the economic activity of the non-governmental economic activity in DC. So that gives you, ORA is looking into sort of how would you come up with a better revenue estimate of the impact of expanding into include nonprofits. I do think in talking it through with ORA folks and thinking about it more, I think there are a number of challenges around things like how do you define gross receipts or gross revenues for a nonprofit that may be funded by foundation. These are not unsolvable problems, but there are a number of pretty significant technical problems. The question of apportionment too. So a lot of DC-based nonprofits actually have offices all around the country. So how do you think about that apportionment question? So unlike private sector businesses, for a custom, the apportionment rules are now oriented around private sector businesses. You have to figure out how to adapt those rules to nonprofits. So there's just an additional chunk of. Is there a precedent
for this for another city or municipality?
With almost everyone, Virginia, New Hampshire, Texas, the other sort of Washington State, 501c3 nonprofits, which is the majority of nonprofits, are not subject to those things.
What about property taxes? Are they subject to property taxes in DC?
Yes, if they are not exempted by the federal government explicitly, and if they are not primarily serving DC residents. So there was a court case, Cato Institute filed a court case basically saying, hey, they're a nonprofit, we don't want to pay taxes. And they lost the case because they are a nonprofit, but they're not primarily serving DC residents.
I'm just thinking that one of the big benefits of DC right now, one of the really things that is really working and will continue to create jobs is some of our tourism, and a lot of our tourism is driven by not-for-profit, it's Smithsonian, just by way of example. And as they expand and continue to be large property owners, I sort of sit here, I'm sitting here a little bit conflicted because we want to drive people, we want to drive jobs, but are we driving the best economic impact? And so I'm just thinking, if they took over some of the buildings downtown, then that's taking those buildings off the property tax right now as well.
Yeah, so
And I
arts,
don't know how to think about that. Are you
arts,
paying taxes?
education,
You pay taxes, you're buying, sorry.
Keep bidding on incorporated tax, but we're a government property.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to, you're a government property, so you don't pay tax, so you
You
do
pay property tax.
it. You do it.
No, you guys, you pay sales tax.
Right, and we pay the
Sales tax.
unincorporated business tax.
Sorry, I'm just trying to think that through. And maybe it doesn't belong in this room, but as I'm trying to think through the downtown and how we bring downtown back, and we all need to be thinking about that. And we need to be driving jobs, because people are gonna live close to their jobs and drive residents. But then I think about the great institutions that people want to come here and be a part of, that can't be replicated in Virginia or Maryland. We can talk all we want, but maybe sports teams can, but Smithsonian can't be, right? I mean, it can't be. But if they're not gonna pay property tax either, then, I don't know, my head is sort of scratching
Well,
around.
Jody,
because I
let me
need
pick up on
help.
what you're saying. I mean, if so much of our economic comeback plan now is entertainment and cultural based, correct?
Well,
We're
no,
talking
I
about all
think
these universities having campuses downtown. So is this the time to send the message, the best time or the worst time? I guess that's
Well,
the
it's
question.
also got to be, so to this point, sitting in here, that brings me back to, I'm sorry I was late, and it brings me back, but I was working on my other not-for-profit job with the task force, but it brings me back to, we've got to create jobs that will create part of this economic engine, or we need to think about how we create an economic engine beyond just tourism with these entertainment. But I'm not going after the Smithsonian, but those types of institutions which are really sacred to DC, and I don't know the answer. I was just wondering if there's a precedent city that, or a precedent that
The
may be out
Smithsonian
there
doesn't
for
even
us.
pay sales taxes on retail.
I don't know, part of me thinks that's great, and part of me thinks like, how are we gonna work through all of this?
There are maybe 50 organizations that federal government, explicitly exempt from paying any kind of taxes, property taxes especially. It's like the American Heart Association, it's the Smithsonian. They've been codified in the DC government's tax code. We can undo those, but they can then go back to the Congress and ask
Yeah,
for redoing
I don't
those.
wanna
It's
go
just-
down a rabbit hole here, I'm just trying to understand that there's precedent.
yeah, there are other, so a lot of states exempt all nonprofits. And then cities within those states are in the position of, well, that we have no choice, that we've lost a big chunk of our, Boston or Philadelphia, they've lost a big chunk of our tax base to the universities. What they often do then is go and negotiate with those universities to make a payment in lieu of taxes. And we heard about a program in Boston that's pretty robust, that raises a portion of the tax that those institutions otherwise would pay if they were commercial.
Could you educate me on that a little bit, just as we're thinking about downtown, not here, but except.
Yeah, I'll send you what we have. DC's a little different because we wouldn't have to necessarily negotiate. We could just say, as Yeship says, we could just start taxing some of those entities. So Johns Hopkins obtained that, put a lot of money into a big building right on the mall. Should they be paying a portion of what they spent on renovating that building in property taxes? That's the question.
Do you mind if we just go through the list?
I'm sorry,
Well,
yeah.
I'm sorry, but it's the list of exemptions. It's federal properties, it's art galleries, It's anything Congress has exempted. It's library buildings. It's buildings belonging to institutions. This is the Yusham exception. Buildings belonging to institutions engaged in not-for-profit activities that are principally directed towards the district. Hospitals are exempt. Buildings belonging to colleges, universities, schools, et cetera, including all the out-of-state universities who are here. Buildings belonging to foundations are exempt. I mean, there's a whole list of
David, is that by federal edict or local edict? Sorry.
Local law. Yeah, so you have the National Geographic, the American Pharmaceutical Association, the Medical Society of DC, National Lutheran Home, the National Academy of Sciences, the Brookings Institution, our nice friends from Brookings, the American Forestry.
Well, what should we be thinking about?
There's a whole list, is what I'm saying, in this statute.
And I just think we should, I don't know what I think, but I think we should be thinking about this a little bit, because if this is our future, this is a huge part of our future. How should we be thinking through this?
Jody, I actually agree with where you're going very much. I think the problem is we're late in the game in terms of public input, and this is a profound idea of great consequence that has never been in the chairman's mark. No one's really reacted to it. The people affected, and it's kind of late in our process. I mean,
But the
we
world
can change
is,
that, but
well, the only question I would have is, it seems to me, I don't know what to do with this, and Tony, I'm looking at you out of the corner of my eye, but it just feels to me like the world has radically changed over the last 30 days, and I think I've been sort of a gloom and doom person saying it's coming, and it's here, and we have, and so is it too late in the process, or should we extend the process to think about some of these things, which maybe not what anybody in this room wants to hear, and you guys can all just shoot me right now, but I just think that I mean, I've been out there, sorry, saying it's coming, and it's come. I mean, when you open your paper yesterday and Fannie Mae's out, and I think it's just the beginning, and we gotta figure out how to create jobs, because without jobs, why do people wanna live here? They can live across I mean, I know this is, but really, all the kids, my kids, all the people my kids' age, they're going to Virginia left and right when they're leaving the city. The millennials that we thought we have forever, education. I mean, we've got to figure out how to keep these jobs here and these people here. But maybe that's not the tax revision. I don't know. And Tony, I'll be quiet. Sorry.
We did talk about options for particularly doing a payment in lieu of taxes program in the fall. So it's not like this will be a totally new idea to the commission. That's all I have on the sort of business tax, business activity tax portion. Should we move on? Should we keep going through our list? You got some of the other issues here?
I personally, I mean, it's really something to the appetite of the commissioners. I think if you were saying, well, we're taking cognizance of new information, and we're also considering overture or negotiation with, or application to, or you look at it, nonprofits, and invite comment on that, and see what they can do with it.
It wouldn't be the first time the idea has come up in these communities. You just do a Google search for old news clips. Every few years, the idea of taxing, particularly the big universities, comes up.
And maybe tax, I heard you talk about something that was different than a tax. It was a payment in lieu. I mean, I'm not educated enough to lead this conversation. I'd like time to be educated on it.
I can share that around.
The top line is it's doable, relatively small. It's a Band-Aid, not a medical procedure. Like these localities, they go to war with the universities, they go to war with the hospitals, it creates political tension, and they get tens of millions of dollars. That's real money. That can support things, that can offset other taxes.
but it will never be a large sum of money. It's just inherent to the structure of what you're
It
doing.
is
It's sort of like
but,
private.
but are we, the only question I have, and listen, I want to be educated. The only question I would ask is DC exceptional than the other municipalities, just because I feel like we're heavily weighted, but that could be wrong.
Exceptional and
Would it be more than just a few, I mean, I don't want to throw around a few million, but it would be more.
A fellow from
than
Boston
that,
said it was $25 million.
Yes, we
Okay.
took like the 20, and we took like the Boston program, sort of mapped it onto the DC property tax exemptions, which most of the money, the DC nonprofit exemptions, setting aside the federal government, the embassies, which we can't.
Which is where
we
DC
can't
is really
tax.
district odd.
What it really is education and hospitals, and that's, yeah, in the low tens of millions. What you would get if you did a payment in lieu of taxes. Again, it's real money. That's the work of the street.
Okay.
But number, say, you want us to move downtown, you want us to.
Well, they can't move the Smithsonian.
Oh, no, I'm not arguing.
But I will leave that to you guys to,
One thing I would consider is non-profits that, put into a fund that goes into some kind of home value incentive for the people who live in the non-profits. Whether you see, they can really get money out of each additional resident.
But I think if we enter into that conversation of nonprofits, which I don't object to doing, I think you have to ask the question, because not all nonprofits are equal and they don't all contribute the same thing. And so what do classes of nonprofits contribute that increases the tax base, that provides jobs, or that provides a benefit that if they didn't, the government would otherwise be burdened to provide? And so you're going to hear arguments from hospitals in that regard about uncompensated care and about the work that they do for those who have an inability to pay or who are marginalized. You're going to hear that from other universities who contribute to the tax base by doing commercial development or affordable housing to say, in addition to their argument about the mission of sort of what they do. So if we enter that conversation, I mean, we enter it, but you'll hear they're not all, like a museum's contribution is going to be a different argument than a hospital's and a university, and we'll have to sort of prosecute that conversation as it comes.
We don't think about that. We don't think about for-profit entities that way. Some of them produce Gucci shoes, and we can, debate the value of Gucci shoes, and others provide Band-Aids and syringes and whatever. We don't sit here and say the marginal value to the society of this company is higher than this, so let's tax them at a lower rate. I think this is less about it's not about our personal view of the value of these entities, but it's more, it's more about everybody has to pay, you get the services, and you could say, hey, we have a campus, we have our own police, we're not really getting the services. And those to me would be more valuable points or sort of in this context, because the idea is to say everybody pays. You're getting something.
I wasn't making an argument about our personal belief about value. It was about the objective of the firm. Because whether you do a good thing or a great thing, or you have a different view of that from a for-profit perspective, their motivation to earn and reward their owners is different than that of a nonprofit.
In some cases, yes. In others, the nonprofit is nothing but a for-profit where you cannot take home the profits. It could be tax benefits. It could be many reasons why we have nonprofits. Maybe they're trying to maximize their reputation and not their profits. But there's
But my point is that there's differentiation in that conversation amongst nonprofits.
Rashad, I'm very sensitive to protecting and not harming our local nonprofits who provide services to district residents. Very sensitive to that. I'm wondering, I'd be interested in your opinion as the former city administrator, named Williams, who ran the program, DSLBD. Could we apply the DSLBD criteria to nonprofits? Yes, if I'm
Sorry.
You start,
I won't
you don't mind.
Okay, all right, you're right.
Try not to react when you talk, all right?
You're right.
So the point is, To be a CBE, for instance, you have to have your principal office in the District of Columbia. Your bank account has to be in the District of Columbia. More than 50% of your employees are District of Columbia residents, or 50% of your quote-unquote sales happen in the district. So let's look at the extreme. We have Howard. You would check all of those boxes. Your revenue is here. You would probably take the revenue approach over the employee approach, and you would pick. If you are Rashawn's nonprofit, let's say he has employees who meets the 50% threshold, but his sales could be in Pennsylvania. It doesn't matter. You look at AARP, it's a large entity. Maybe they're headquartered here, maybe their bank is here, but I don't think you could argue that half of their economic activity is here, nor half of their employees district residents. Now, they could check the box if they hire a bunch of district residents. I imagine if you went to ARP, and I'm not picking on that, I'd be surprised if anywhere near half of their employees were district residents.
So
Right?
it might move more people into the city.
But I do think, look, it's an imperfect thing. How do we differentiate? How do we identify those that are district-centric versus those that are not? There's a way to do it. It's just whether or not we want to.
Right, I hear you. So it would incentivize then jobs or people living in the city.
It would.
Which I also think then gets to more income tax. I mean, right, if they live in the city, then we're getting to.
I agree, and it's a trade-off for
Yeah.
that benefit.
Yeah, so there are things to study here. I live in the mayor, but there are things to study here I'm just not educated on that could be interesting. That's all. I don't know. So,
Should we take a 10-minute break and then reconvene and move on to some of the other items on this list?
Are we gonna break at 3?
And then,
Oh, yeah, we done
still
it.
aiming we're wrapping up at 3. Yeah, so we'll just make this a reconvene at 2:15.
sorry, I got this.
want to propose a slightly different, that we skip some of these smaller topics. I'm happy to tackle them, maybe in writing or at a later date. But I want to jump ahead and make a couple of points, and then have a revenue neutrality conversation, because I think we're at the point where that's now a significant thing to talk about. We did the two biggest, in addition to the business activity tax, the other big revenue raiser, not as big as that, that was in the chairman's mark, was an increase residential property tax targeted to high value homes. And I heard a lot of concerns and questions raised about that when we at the last meeting, to the point where I'm not sure, based on what I heard in the last meeting, I don't know if we get as much revenue, nearly as much revenue, even in what was in the chairman's mark out of that. So I think it would, at this point, it would be helpful, since the two big, big questions have been raised about the two big revenue raisers in this chairman's mark that were then intended to pay for the general tax credit, improvements in property tax circuit breaker, business tax rates. I think it's appropriate for the commission to have a discussion about what should the recommendations look like in light of what we all have heard from each other so far.
With regard to what?
With regards to revenue neutrality in particular, so do we want to continue? Do you want to explore other ways of raising the revenue to pay for some of the things that we've talked about? Do we want to move away from revenue neutrality? Is there ways to do that? David put on the table last time maybe triggers, essentially paying for it out of future revenue surpluses. So I think it's appropriate for the commission to sort of hash out the general outlines of the package if the general outlines of the package are not going to look like what's in the chairman's mark, and maybe sort of for purposes of discussion, since major questions have been raised about the revenue sides that are in the chairman's mark. What is that? What is the implications of that? I think it would be helpful for us as staff to hear.
And Nick, can I say, if we decide to step away from revenue neutrality and we go towards a trigger, whatever that trigger is, not defer to the mayor and Rashad who run the city to give us an idea. If we go in the past, what we've done was a 5%, which at the time would allow government to grow twice the rate of inflation. And then all the revenue above that, we would stagger the ideas, the things we want funded in order of what we, as a consensus, believe is most important. And let's say it's the child tax credit. And so we would line them up, and this could take a while, it could take a couple of years. The second thing I like about, again, Rashad, don't be mad, but the thing I like about having a 5% threshold is it helps level out the growth of government in a way that one year, and we have had 13% increases in revenue one year to the next, we start baking that into our baseline budgets, and it becomes a little unsustainable over time. I think it also encourages a little discipline in the legislature to have to make choices if they want to go above 5%. And I think it's a moderate, easy-ish alternative to having neutrality and having to forego things that we think are important.
We've been meeting for 16 months, and although we've never adopted revenue neutrality as one of our precepts, it all culminated into a chairman's mark, which circulated broadly across the city for input as revenue neutral. So de facto, that's the way we've been operating. Now we're at the 11th and a half hour. We're revisiting that. David, I respect what you're saying, but that's the old expenditure commission idea. We're going to use this policy, we're going to use this commission to discipline the council on how it's to spend money, which is not our charter. And so I think, and by the way, the council and the mayor have spent the budget surpluses 5 times over for the next 10 years. So basically what we're saying is do nothing. And I just don't see in this climate handing the council something, and the mayor for that matter, that's not budget neutral is not helpful at all. And it is about making choices, not just the council, but us. And we've been operating for 16 months, collating at a chairman's mark that was all about revenue neutrality, and now we're not. So I'm a bit frustrated.
I share that frustration. I think, I'm the person in the room who actually thinks we should be raising revenue, and that we actually need to put more into spending. We just did some polling showing that there's actually voters are reporting a lot of hardship, especially Black voters in the district, and that the voters more broadly really support more investment in things like home homelessness, making housing affordable, expanding child care, and all of these things. We are given the charge, though, to, at a minimum, help the district meet its projected revenue needs into the future. We have a financial plan. We know that there are big budget pressures right now. We know that we have a major shortfall with Metro. At a minimum, we should be meeting revenue neutrality to not undermine council's ability to handle those cost pressures and to handle the shortfall with Metro. If anything, I think we should be raising revenue. It's my compromise position in this space to go with revenue neutrality. I think it is a bare minimum of sort of responsible decision making that we can pursue to make sure that we're not undermining council's ability to pay for the things that we do for the next many years. And I think triggers are also not only what Rashad said the last session, problematic in terms of tying the hands of lawmakers or sort of a way to discipline them, which is not our job, but are also impractical. I mean, if you think about some of the things we're trying to do through the chairman's mark, the impact of them will be greatly diminished if we are implementing them in incremental ways. Like, we can do a little bit here, and then it's going to take another 5 years before we get to enough growth to get to the next step in any given tax cut that's in this package. So I just think it's like an impractical thing to pursue.
I think there's a practical reason. At least we should give some thought to what it looks like in the financial plan right now. This year, we're balancing the budget with $166 million in ESSER funds, plus $700+ million of cost savings. In the financial plan, there is not a single year where the recurring revenue is high enough to pay for recurring expenditures. We keep filling that gap with one-time money from our past. That's an argument for spending discipline and all of that stuff, but that's also an argument against triggers in some ways, because then if you start triggering, it basically, the difference between how the conditions under which we're operating and the previous tax revision commission where the triggers was used was it was a rapidly growing economy with rapidly growing revenue, and the triggers took advantage of the typical conservativeness in the CFO's revenue estimates. I think if we go down forget the message sounding to the council, forget the hand tying, it's just not going to happen. I'm actually curious to get Glenn's views on how he sees, I know that you're coming up with your revenue estimates, but how, just generally, do you see robust revenue growth in our future, which would be necessary to do the triggers?
Yeah, one word, no. No, we expect general government revenues to grow between 2.5% and 3% over the next several years. And part of our estimate also indicates, a vacancy or unpaid rate of downtown office buildings of between 27 and 30% by 2027. So we think we're pretty glum about the future, but that leads, so far that seems about right, and that leads to extremely slow growth. To your point about fund balances, the district will go through those that we can go through by the end of 2007 and 27, I'm sorry. And the district will have to learn to live then without those moving forward.
I would like to learn more. I don't know the triggers are right or wrong, but I think regardless, we have a hard 3 or 4 years ahead of us as a city, and we should be thinking long-term about where we want to be as a city in 8 to 10 years. And I, for one, want this to be a thriving city that has great educational institutions, but it has a place that can fiscally support a lot of the programs, Erica, that you talk about. I'm not opposed to any of them, but what I worry about is that they are all threatened unless we are willing to take some hard times to actually create a future that is vibrant here. That means we attract jobs, that means we attract housing, we attract people who want to live here. And we have to take that seriously. And I do think spending since 2020 has gone up 30.4%. Is that the right number?
34%.
34%, okay, and revenues have only, and so we have to, I am not for doing this revenue neutral, and I'm not changing my point of view. I have said this from the beginning. I think it is gonna take cutting some costs right now. And it's unfortunate, but I think if we really wanna be a thriving city that we wanna be, we're gonna have to make some very hard decisions. So I, for one, am not for having to send this back neutral. I'm sorry, I've been very consistent here. I think we have to figure out how to expand the base. And so I don't know that I'm opposed to triggers at all. For me, I wanna understand exactly, and if they don't work, and I hear, Rashad, I'm listening to you intently in the last couple of meetings about the implications of those. But I think we have to figure out something.
Just a final point. I had an opportunity. The CFO was very kind to spend time with me last week talking about this. I see the revenue projections in FY25. It's only 2.8%. So in the next few years, we wouldn't hit the 5%. So it may be that the few items that are not paid for, because many of them are with some tax increases, some items that we don't go forward, it might take a few years. But we also are a resilient city, and if we start doing things right and start sending the right signals, things change quickly. So, city administrator or the CFO can correct me, but we haven't yet incorporated the fourth quarter improvement in the stock market as a part of these projections. And why is that important? Because our income tax is heavily dependent on gains, capital gains. So he's working on his projection now. We should have something middle of February that can help. Maybe it offsets, maybe it's better, maybe it's not. Look, I just think that if we, if the answer is we have to raise taxes in order to meet these priorities, I'm just not there. And I think the middle ground is through this. Now, as far as the needs of the city, many of us have been listening to this for 20 plus years and have been participants in expanding these programs. It is undeniable that we spend 3 times what our neighboring jurisdictions do and yet don't have the same results. Jim and I can't walk down the street in our neighborhood without fear. Let's just be honest. And so the notion that if you just give us more money, things will be better, we have been there. We are the most taxed, highest per capita social expenditures in the country, and we don't have the results to show for it. As I said before, last 10 years, our population has grown 4%. Our public payroll has grown 22%. I wish that the folks who are concerned about social services would help put the shoulder to the wheel in terms of making sure the expenditures are wisely spent. That would resonate with me.
So I just got to ask, Mr. Chairman, we had this discussion a year ago about whether we are an expenditure commission or not. And I thought it was resolved that we weren't. Now, if we are, then let's go back and we can, now we're talking about starving government to shrink it. I just don't see, if I read the law about what our mandate is, it's not in there.
But neither is it to be neutral, in all fairness, Gregory.
Oh, fine.
It doesn't say that. And so what we're trying...
The rhetoric here is that we should force the government to shrink programs by starving it for money. That's what you're saying.
No, that's not what we're saying. I'm saying that that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying look, let's assume there's $1 billion worth of our recommendations, and right now we can pay for $700 million. For the remaining $300 million, what I'm suggesting is we look at targets, and we do it as we can pay for it. That's it.
David, you've been very skeptical over the course of last year about this council's fiscal responsibility. Am I not correct?
I think I'm not alone in that.
Okay, but do you think then that this council is going to get a proposal from us that's going to require some modicum of cuts to programs to fund what we all know that we want to fund? Is that what you're saying?
Let me be clear if I haven't been. I'm not proposing cuts to the budget. I'm proposing that if the budget grows over, say, 5%, that we would buy down some of these benefits. That's not a cut, because you allow the government to grow twice the rate of inflation. That's not a cut. I'm not asking for a single dollar less in spending. In fact, I'm willing to accommodate a 5% annual increase in spending.
The baseline budget, what Glenn said earlier, is going to increase by whatever he said it was going to.
Which means it may take
and
us.
As we've just seen, just recently, SNAP and the housing programs, we have current programs that run out of money 3 months into the fiscal year. So there are fiscal pressures already with the current budget.
Which means which means it may take us a couple of years to realize some of these reductions that we would pay for through the increased revenue. I'm willing to be patient. Look, we've had this, we've done this successfully before. We did this in 1999 to 2008. It took patience, a steady counsel. And I don't think we're getting into expenditures. Not one person here is recommending we cut this program or that program. What we're saying is live within your means. And we're not going to do your work for you by taxing, just in a large way without. Look, there's no. Anyway, I've said my piece. People have a different point of view. Gregory, I respect the fact that we have been operating under a neutrality as an assumption, but not a mandate. And so here we are at the end of the day, and we are. But I've always thought we were looking at things so that we would get to this point and make final recommendations untethered by commitments we made when the process started.
Fair enough.
So look, we can agree to disagree, Gregory, and I just think we just have to, count the votes, and whoever wins, wins. That's it.
To that end, I wonder if others want to weigh in. Sam, Rashad, Carolyn, Jim.
I mean, I don't have anything new to say as to my perspective about neutrality that I said last week. I lean against triggers, but I'm open to the discussion. If we're going to take $275 million in revenue off the table because we're not going to do the VAT tax, if that's where it lands, then we're going to have to make different decisions. It is either balancing against the remaining revenue, which I count to be about $100 million, I think, maybe less, 75 to 100. I was trying to do quick math. So we either balance against that revenue number for things that we can't afford and leave the rest unspoken to, or we put some trigger for those things that we really want, which is not my inclination, but I think, I would decide and say this is it, like once we see what it is. So my position hasn't particularly changed about how I view it, but it does mean if we're not going to do the VAT tax, that lots of stuff are coming off the table, and we got to decide what that then looks like.
Well, I mean, it's kind of a resounding kind of tunnel here. For me personally, I think it's interesting because I agree in many ways with the fact that there's no context for. I said this last time, right? So I thought we had we got to a place of harmony with VAT tax. Clearly, people had, there's different perspectives on that. You can't miss the fact that we're having people leave the city. I have Josh Eastwright on my board. He's the CEO of Bloomberg BNA. They just moved to Crystal City, right? So I understand the movements that are happening from the city to Northern Virginia because it's happening on my board. So I'm worried for the city, just like everyone around this table. And so to open the paper and see someone else leave the city is also problematic. You layer that with crime, we've talked about it. So I don't want to rehash what everyone has said. Where I stand is, I'm willing to change with the environment that's being presented. So I'm not, I haven't had a static position since I started. I actually am in agreement with the idea of ensuring that our social programs that our Black residents in our communities, we need to shore those up and strengthen them while simultaneously thinking about how to make our city more competitive. And we haven't got that secret sauce here yet. Like, I don't think we've gotten that here yet. And so that's kind of my 2 cents on this. I mean, it's funny that Mayor Williams, your position on the VAT tax changed with the change of the news. I think not to do that would not be smart, wouldn't be prudent, right? Right. So I think my point is I'm staying malleable based on what the context presents us as the best solution for the city, because I love this city. And so that's really my position. My position hasn't changed either. So.
I just wanted to say, I think last week I mentioned that I was surprised that we did come to a revenue neutral recommendation platform. I wasn't sure that we agreed to that initially. I think it was discussed, but when all the proposals came back and that's where we were, I was a bit surprised. The triggers that David talked about, I think might be a consideration, particularly if you talk about where we are currently financially. We don't know where we're going to be 5 years or 10 years down the road. And as Jody said, as much as most of us probably would not want to continue the commission, I think if we put a trigger process in place, that at some point we would have to kind of reconvene and look at where we are in terms of revenue growth, that kind of thing. So the triggers to me is not something that I would dismiss, but I think it has to be given some more thought in terms of what would be the process of enforcing those triggers.
I agree. I think we need to understand.
Yeah, I think we're at a point that, so much has been thrown at us over the course of these 16 months, and it's not over. So there's so much uncertainty that we're going to have to, and we still have not found a way to, as Jody said, broaden that base.
But that was
Enlarge.
Expand the base. That's
I want
right.
to be clear.
Yeah, because the mayor taught us the difference between
and I know exactly where I stand.
I wonder if John Budolf or someone else from the council's budget office can help better explain how the triggers worked the last time around, and maybe some assessment of how they would have worked in today's revenue environment, because
Well, do we start with just the basics? So to go over in 2013, that commission put forward a relatively small tax cut. It's something like $50 million in tax cuts when you added up the raisers and the cuts. The council then took that and they took out one of the major raisers. So it became a bigger tax cut. I'm going to say 200 million, I'm ballparking that, don't hold me to it. It was just too much for them to do at the time. So then they did triggers. What their trigger is the council and the mayor would get an initial forecast, they would do their budget, they would lock it in. And then if and only if revenue came in above the budget that they had completed and signed off on, did those excess funds then go to the triggers. And so, as kind of Yesem was talking about, this was a period of rapid revenue expansion, and so it did not take very long for the council to sit down, do their full budget, everyone's happy with it, and then for revenue to come in and then do that. And to be clear, we didn't recommend triggers in 2013. We didn't make any of those decisions. That was totally the council in Mendelson's office that said, we're going to do this excess revenue only to the trigger, and then they itemized the list that they wanted in the ways that they would have it. Is that helpful? Can I explain that?
That's helpful.
I think the words of the CFO earlier, maybe he wants to repeat them about the forecast, should influence this conversation dramatically.
So I think that it's a question of, if you're along the lines of, so all the way back at the beginning, I felt that we should look at what the need was before we looked at how we're going to satisfy the need. And we were told that really isn't our commission.
Yeah.
So we left that aside and we moved toward neutrality. A lot has happened since then. I think it's really important that if you're of my mind at least, that you campaign for sending a signal to the world that things are going to be different. Now, do we do this as part of the commission, or do we do it after the commission? Do we say as a commission, or at least some of us say as part of the commission, there's only so much we could do with the charge we have, and leave the fight for more competitive tax system and incentives later? Or do we draw the line now and say we need to send a signal, we need to send a message that we're really serious about making DC competitive? Because again, as I talk to people about the VAT, I talk to corporate executives, what do you think of the tax package we have here? And it was kind of, it's got a lot of complication, a lot of this and that. It's not a powerful signal. The argument is we need to make a powerful signal now. It's not revenue neutral, and the council needs to get the message that things have changed between the time you charged us with our mandate and now. And yes, you need to make some changes to the budget. And as someone who's run the government, we have a lot of whats, which are programs that no one has idea what we're doing. Anyway, programs where we're not sure what the strategy is and going in the right direction. We may be going in the right direction, we're ineffective. We may be going in the right direction and we're effective and we're inefficient. That whole spectrum is a lot of money, and that's how we get from 6 billion to 15 million, 20 years later, $20 billion. It's a lot of money. So we're saying, yes, we need to economize. And so my problem with triggers is not so much their intent, it's just whether we need to really be even more disciplined about it. It's not the general notion of, and it's not starving the government, it's just understanding we're in a serious situation here. And I actually think, we shouldn't spend on these programs, and we cut taxes and reduce revenue. I don't know whether it makes me a believer in the Laffer curve, that's academic. I think that in DC, and I can't speak for other cities, if you make these changes, if you show discipline, it can rebound in economic growth. We've seen that. We made some hard decisions 20 years ago. Look where we are now. We're in a great place.
I'm a believer in the city, like Rashad said. I am a believer, and I believe it can rebound. I do think we're in for a very hard 3 or 4 years, but I think I feel like it is my responsibility to send a signal to the council that we believe in the city, but we have to make some hard choices right now. If we don't make them now, we're going to continue to open the paper every day, and I don't know how we rebound.
Here's the alternative, though. Sorry, Gregory. This is what I worry about. Is essentially, if this package goes to the council without really, the council can look at it. I don't think that it's revenue neutral or not. It's not even here or there. I mean, they can do whatever they want to. For me, one of the messages we need to send is, here's a tax package that kind of moves the DC from yesteryear to tomorrow. If we don't do that, you know what's going to happen in the 2025 budget? They're going to increase the personal income taxes. That'll be the end of it. Again, and maybe
I don't know what you're saying. It might be the end of it, but I think that I understand that they can't move it, but I think we need to send them a message that they will that they will see.
But I don't know if they'll listen, Jody.
They might not listen. I can't help that. But I can't help that in the file, there is a strong recommendation that we have to do things differently.
If we're going to, nobody used these words, but if we do believe there are ineffective, wasteful, underachieving programs that should be, I must say, eliminated, changed, or reformed, then let's have the guts as a commission to name them. Let's hear testimony about them, and let's put a package together.
Okay.
But right now, we're saying, we don't want to name the cuts. There are just cuts out there that need to happen because they're inefficient. We won't name what they are, but let's just go ahead, council, and do the work.
Don't we say that at the beginning, and you were the one who said I don't know?
What's that? I've never said that we're here to look at what's efficient or effective or programs that are performing well. Now, if we're going to say that that's part of the problem, and that's the message we need to send, then let's send the message and let's say what those programs are.
Okay.
And let's get testimony, let's get some expert advice, let's have people that are gonna be affected by those cuts have their say.
I mean, we were told by Chairman Mendelson that that absolutely was not our charge and we shouldn't go down that road. I think that the notion that we're gonna send a package full of tax cuts that would deplete revenue, that is not kind of the same thing, but without as much sort of exploration into what we're cutting and what efficiencies can actually be had. It's like the same thing. None of that is our job. We were asked to take a look at the tax code to build something that, like Yeshim said, modernizes our tax code, make sure we're keeping up with changes in the economy, make sure that we're broadening our base and building in resiliency, make sure that we're looking at equity and progressive revenue. It doesn't say whether we have to raise or not, but it does say that we're supposed to have an eye to the ability of the government to meet projected revenue needs. Now that may be like something that you may look at the projected revenue needs from our financial plan and say, well, I don't believe we need to do that much spending, but that's not your job. Your job is to make sure that we have the revenue to meet that projected need that's out there already. I mean, I think that it's crazy that we're having this conversation again. And
I think it's irresponsible not to have the conversation. I'm sorry.
it is
Erica,
not
I was-
irresponsible. It is irresponsible to
irresponsible.
take things off the table completely. I mean, we're really literally sitting here now saying, we're not gonna touch the VAT. That's the biggest single revenue raiser in the package. We know that there are people around the table that also don't want to look at residential property taxes. That's it. There's nothing else in there. Everything else in there that is raising revenue is like kind of guesswork, may or may not come through, and small potato. So what are we really talking about here? I mean, I just think we're like circling wagons around stuff that we talked about a year and a half ago. And it just feels like there's an effort here to explode the whole package and the whole process.
Can we see, just out of interest, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Director, if we took out those revenue sources, what would a package look like that was revenue neutral? So let's put that together. Maybe it'll look good.
I mean, but, you know, order of magnitude, I guess what I'm not sure about is that the explicit idea of the business activity tax was not to raise new revenue, but rather to, in important ways, change the way the district taxes businesses in order to broaden the base and lower rates. So we have lower business taxes spread out over a larger number of business taxpayers. So I could use some guidance as to whether, if we're taking the business activity tax off the table, are we also taking off the table all of the business tax reductions that it was going to balance against?
Let me hear you, if I may, repeat the rationale that you just gave for the business tax.
The rationale for the business activity tax was that we've got a bunch of business entities in the district that for decades, because of the district's unique federal situation, these entities have been not paying taxes as business entities. And, you know, so big law partnerships, accounting firms, and lobbying firms. In addition, potentially to a lesser extent, there are big for-profit corporations who arrange their finances in such a way that they're not paying that they don't have any taxable profits, and this also would have them pay tax at a relatively low percentage rate. And we've talked about percentage rates anywhere from 0.5% to 2.4%, with the chairman's fund coming in at 1.4%. So that was the rationale, and then to use the revenue freed up that would create to buy down other taxes, potentially to repeal other taxes as a way of saying, hey, we're getting rid of business license fees. We're getting rid of the personal property tax, which is a burden on everybody. We're getting rid of the UB tax or whatever. So the question is, and this is an honest question to help respond to Gregory's query, is if we put together a package, do we also want to, are we also giving up on the idea of reducing these other business taxes, or are we gonna put those in as net revenue neutrals?
So it might also be helpful, because I would give great deference and weight to our chairman's opinion. So right now, we don't have a chairman's mark. What's before us is no longer valid. So it would be helpful to know what the chairman's mark now is, and then we can react to it. I would give deference to that. I don't know what it is, but I would give deference to
I'm
that.
sorry to disappoint people. I put the chairman's mark out there as a point of discussion. I'm not a refrigerator. I went out and I actually talked to people, and they said, whatever you think of the merits of the bat, the expected value of it is pretty low because it's not really gonna happen. Not so much that people are gonna fight it and keep it from being legislated. Even if it were legislated, the chance of people taking every advantage not to pay it and hemorrhaging out what's left of commercial property, to me, is a risk too great. That's
I respect that.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, as you're gonna solicit ideas about what your next mark would look like, I'll like to offer you a suggestion. And so if, for instance.
Did you finish though? Wait a minute. Did you
I'm sorry,
finish,
Gregory.
No, I'm just saying, your point's well taken, and I respect that, but I would like to know where you stand as a whole package then. And then that would influence me.
So the 1 through 6 equals $275 million. That's the amount of the VAT tax. If we were to buy back the repeal of the basic business license fee at 13 million, and then the clean hands issue at 7 million, which we could do, and I'll explain in a second, we'd be exchanging the BAT for not doing the reduction in personal property tax, the repeal of the unincorporated business tax, and the reduction in commercial property. So we would eliminate 1, 3, and 4, Mayor. 1, 3, and 4. We'd eliminate the BAT, and the way we could pay for, this is just my opinion, the way we could pay for the repeal of the business license fees and the clean hands is by adjusting for the $26 million in lost revenue from waiting, for the doubling of fines. We need 20 million. We have 26 million there, so there could be some adjustment with 6 million left over for other priorities. This would be my recommendation.
That would be an option. Other folks have options. We have the headquarters.
Can I make this more complicated? And even more hard for everyone? The business taxes that are on here are in a way not just tied to the BAT's revenue number, but to the idea of shifting it. And if you wanted to do business tax cuts, are those even the business tax cuts that you want if the BAT is gone? Or, again, this creates revenue problems. Is there other things that aren't on here? Again, sorry to make it more complicated, but the goal is to do something with a message, at least even where you want us to think about, or are there other business cuts that are more important?
Well, the 6 million, if I might, which could go towards, for instance, another priority, or we're looking for the 25 million for the incentives for employees. It could go there. We could stay away from, for instance, a BAT for nonprofits, and we could make a recommendation to the council that nonprofit status be tethered to located headquarters here, bank here, 50% of your employees, or 50% of your activities here. Now that would probably, people will howl at the moon, but every nonprofit here in this room would meet those criteria, and it could incentivize the hiring of district residents or increased activity of the nonprofit here. Just a thought.
I think that when you look at firm movements in the region, nonprofits move as often as for-profits. So if you're making the case that this is going to kill the law firms, I don't know why we wouldn't make the case that this is going to kill the nonprofits as well. And you could say, hey, they have property here and all that stuff, but
Maybe a meritorious idea, but the bureaucracy to track that, it's another department now to do just that. And I don't know how the CFO would score that, and how we would anticipate the first couple of years' revenue for that.
Just an idea.
Sure, no?
another idea might be to leave everything as is. UB stays as is, personal property taxes, although anyway, we can move on. And you just do an extremely low bat, like 0.5%, 1/4%, just to see if it flies. That still expands the base to those who are not paying, but it could be just small enough that it doesn't really matter.
We're burning. How much
Yeah.
candy to bring more people businesses?
I don't think it's worth
You don't have
personally.
any money to expand anymore, Jody, because the bat is gone, so are the business incentives.
Plus we prioritize differently.
I appreciate the idea. I think it's not worth the candle to have every business in the city now have 2 accountants, one to figure out the VAT and one to figure out their federal tax. It's not worth the candle.
That's not what would happen, David. They're taking the numbers directly off of their existing tax returns.
If you bear with me, all right?
I bear with you.
That's fine. We can all be frustrated. That's part of the job. But for those of us who've actually been in the world and served people and bear with me, who've been at community meetings, who show up fine.
You're so rude.
That's fine. You can feel that way. I can feel my way. I'll keep it to myself. Go for it. But you get to go in the community where what you think, because you think you think everybody out there knows. You think it's easy for everybody else. And I'm just saying that's not necessarily the case.
But be magnanimous, David, what's the point you want to make?
The point I'm making is that if we go to a smaller bat, it just isn't worth the candle of the administrative process, because you're still going to have.
You can't argue, David, that it's worth taxing the universities and nonprofits because they should be paying their share, and not at the same time apply the same argument to every other business that are not paying their shares. You can tell me whether it's worth its candle or not, but if you lose one argument, you lose both arguments. You can have one and not the other, is the point that I'm trying to
Look, my point is, on the bat, if you are to implement it on a minor level, that's a point of entry. That's where it starts. And once you figure this out, then it's this year, then it's this next year, then it's this and this and this. You also, a bat eliminates any reason for not to tax nonprofits, not to apply to nonprofits, because if it is for the privilege, which is an annoying and vulgar, I think, term to use, for the privilege of doing business, the privilege also applies to nonprofits, and so they should pay it too. I don't think it's worth the candle.
It's the services receipt. And by the way, we do have a tax that everybody pays, which is the gross receipts tax, right?
Do not-for-profit.
Not
So everybody wins a
Anyway, I
So
said
we're
my
scheduled
piece.
to meet again on Friday.
Oh, this Friday?
This Friday. The
Saturday.
weather forecast does not look good, so we
We do it by Zoom.
Yes,
by
it's
Zoom.
by Zoom.
Can I ask you?
Why are you meeting?
I've been waiting all
Yeah,
meeting
I
to say
think
Hold
that.
on, hold on. If I can make one point. The whole thing's been blown up, and the respect that I see this as staff is that you want more options. I think that will take more than 48 hours, and I would.
Yeah,
That makes sense.
I think that's
We
right.
will
There are
find time in a
tons,
couple of
probably
weeks.
one-on-one conversations.
I think that's right. I think we need to give ourselves more time
We're just gonna run out of money. I
to,
will.
When are we running out of money?
I'm gonna run out of money very soon.
Okay.
In the contract, yes.
I mean,
As-
you
as-
have
Sure,
to
but
paperwork
it's
out.
sealed.
Scheduled to March, right? Like, I mean, that's what was it.
Right, the
This is an
budget,
extension.
yeah, for more, we can, well, so 2 issues.
that's how long
Anyway, we can talk about that.
Yes.
But we will find a time probably, and it'll probably take us a week to 10 days to work something together. Thank you all.
I agree with that. You can-
Good.